part of the advocacy group, and really what I wanted to do was just to talk about the work that we do, but also just to update you for those that aren't aware. There have been quite a lot of changes in terms of the availability of treatments, which is clearly very positive for our patients. So in terms of, I've got to be honest and confess that the talk is essentially related to what we're able to deliver within England, NHS England, but clearly the devolved nations are very important, and I know that there will be talks from different people who work in different parts of the country, so there will be maybe particular issues related to Wales, Scotland or Northern Ireland, although I think essentially, from what I understand, most parts of the pathway are the same. I was going to go through the current treatment pathway. I mean, we're prescribed according to lines, and we can talk about that. I've had the pleasure of spending an afternoon going through Blue Tech requirements, and I've kind of listed them on the slide by each line of treatment. That's really important because that will dictate what we're able to deliver or not. I've put a few fictitious cases essentially just to illustrate possible decision making in terms of each line of treatment. And of course, this does not in any way take away from the fact that we should really be enrolling patients in clinical trials. At points, best supportive care for palliation is really important. And of course, the pathway doesn't talk about, and is clearly important, conventional, what we would call conventional old-style treatment with things like cyclophosphamide or melphalan. And of course, one size does not fit all, and it's really important to think about holistic care. So the first thing really just to make people aware that I'm very glad, I'm sure hopefully people are aware, but if they're not aware, that both teclistamab and elranatamab, which are BCMA-directed T-cell engagers, have been approved by NICE, and that is a very, very recent change. And what I've done is I've just listed here in terms of what the Blue Tech requirements are. There was an appeal, and I'm glad to say that actually all patients at fourth line, so long as they meet these criteria, are able to receive either teclistamab or elranatamab, and the issue with pomalidomide that was evident before is no longer the case. So patients can receive teclistamab or elranatamab at fourth line or beyond. Clearly they require prior IMiD, PI and anti-CD38, and I'll touch on that later because there will be those patients that have not received an anti-CD38 prior to going into fourth line, and I think that's an important thing to think about. No issues related to prior POM, no issues related to CAR-T, BCMA-directed CAR-T. There are going to be very few patients, I would imagine, that are going to fill that criteria. And importantly, no issues related to prior BCMA antibody-drug conjugates, such as belantamab. Clearly, if you've had a BCMA-directed bispecific antibody, you would be excluded. And just so that people are aware, teclistamab will go into baseline commissioning, and elranatamab is available on the Cancer Drug Fund. The second change, which I just wanted to highlight in terms of what's happened over the last year, is that selinexor, which is the oral XPO1 inhibitor, has been approved by NICE. It's available at second line for those patients who are both DARA and LEN refractory in combination with Velcade and dexamethasone. That's based on the Boston study. And it's filling a gap for those patients at third line who are lenalidomide refractory. And then there will be a very small group of patients that may be suitable to receive monotherapy with selinexor at fifth line and beyond, and they are truly heavily pretreated, penta-refractory, so 2 PIs, 2 IMiDs, and also an anti-CD38 monoclonal antibody. And then I think it's also important in this audience, because a lot of us will treat amyloid, that this is the first NICE approval for amyloidosis. So this would be daratumumab in combination with VCD. And that, I think, is really a step change. Clearly, getting quick clonal response for patients with AL amyloid is really important, and I'm very glad that this has been approved. So what I was going to do is I'm going to run through the same slide, and what I'm going to do is just go through what the current treatment options are, It's a bit like laws that get passed and never get revoked, and then another law gets passed and then it just continues. So the pathway gets completely crowded, as you can see. It's kind of evolved over time. We never really seem to rescind a prior technology appraisal. The blue text then become quite complex because part of it will be data collection and part of it will be an exclusion for, say, another therapy. We're talking about lines of treatment, but actually the field is moving on now, and it's very much whether you are triple class exposed, triple class refractory, and I would hope in years to come that this would be reflected in the NICE process. And as I've said, conventional chemotherapy is not excluded, or is excluded from this pathway. So the two things I think that this slide illustrates is, one is we should really be talking to our patients. So the doctor turning away from the patient, it's really important that these are shared decision-making things. And then the second thing is, I hope we don't flip a coin in clinic and that we're more guided in terms of the treatments that we're going to offer our patients. Okay, so the first one I just wanted to talk about was upfront first-line treatment. And for a while, we've been able to give Dara-VTD based on the Cassiopeia trial prior to stem cell transplant, then some consolidation prior to lenalidomide maintenance, and then the alternative for the non-transplant eligible pathway would be for probably a lot of our patients are getting daratumumab, lenalidomide dex, DRD, based on the Maya study. The alternatives would be just lenalidomide and dex, or a Velcade-based regimen. I think the first thing to say that has really changed, and I'm really pleased with this, is that the blue tech requirements have now changed. So there's often a discussion now about whether somebody should go on the transplant eligible, ineligible pathway. We used to be able to kick that down the long grass for 4 or 5 months, we'd be able to make a decision. But now the blue tech has changed. So if somebody's on the Dara-VTD pathway, they've had 4 cycles, they've responded, very important that they've responded, and you consider that they are not suitable for stem cell transplant, those patients are able to go on to DRD. And I think that actually is a very positive and welcome change. The other thing to say, I think, is in terms of what happens to patients as they're going through the pathways, and it's very much what prior treatments that they've had is going to determine what treatment they're able to receive. So as you're going through this pathway, patients are clearly going to be likely lenalidomide exposed and likely lenalidomide refractory. They would have often had DRD up front till progression, or they would have had or induction auto and then len maintenance. So a lot of our current patients are clearly going to be lenalidomide refractory, and there will be most patients will probably be daratumumab exposed, and for those on the DRD pathway, they're going to be daratumumab refractory as well. But we should really remember that actually there's a large number of patients that we're seeing in clinic that have clearly never gone through this pathway, and actually it's going to have big impacts on what they're going to be able to have further down the line. So there will be a large number of patients who've gone through first line, never had lenalidomide, never had daratumumab, but it will clearly have an impact on what treatments they're able to receive later down the line, and I'll go through some cases to illustrate that. When we get to second line, I mean, this is six different treatments are kind of listed. Clearly, we're not going to be giving Velcade monotherapy, so there are lots of choices available. And what I've done is I've listed the blue tech requirements, if you're able to see, for each of the therapies. I think the big decision that we need to make at second line is according to whether somebody's had prior lenalidomide and whether they're refractory to it. So if they've not had prior lenalidomide, it would be appropriate to consider things like carfilzomib, lenalidomide and dex, or maybe just the oral lenalidomide and dex. Clearly, they could also receive daratumumab, or they could receive carfilzomib. I think what I've listed in the bottom of the slides is there are some restrictions. So, for example, carfilzomib, len-dex, clearly no prior lenalidomide. In terms of lenalidomide, no prior bortezomib. In terms of DVD, you just can't be refractory to daratumumab, you can have been exposed. And for carfilzomib and dexamethasone, the issue is that you are either thought to be PI naive or at least have a 6-month treatment-free period. Then they're going to be a group of patients that are refractory to lenalidomide. Clearly, they can't get KRD or RD, and then you would think about either daratumumab, Velcade-Dex, or carfilzomib, dexamethasone. And then there's going to be a small group now, but will be evolving over time, that are both Dara and Len refractory, and those patients are able to access selinexor with Velcade. So small numbers now, but maybe more going forward. And of course, we should think about salvage transplant. Okay, so then the question is, what should we choose at second line? And I've just got some cases that really just illustrate what I've been talking about. So if you have a patient who's had VCD, plus or minus an auto, what should you consider at second line? Well, actually, you've got quite a lot of options, haven't you? You consider KRD, RD, Velcade or carfilzomib, assuming that they weren't having issues with toxicity and they had a reasonable number of a treatment-free period. But say you have somebody that's lenalidomide refractory, so say they've gone through DVTD, transplant and Len maintenance, then clearly you're not going to be able to give KRD or RD, and then you would have to consider either DVD or carfilzomib, and we should really consider the concept of a second autograft for our patients if they've had a long period of remission. At third line, and I think third line is really has become an unmet need, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Most patients probably would have received lenalidomide by this time. So if they've not had lenalidomide by this time, according to the pathway, I would suggest that probably Ixalendex would be an appropriate treatment. Ixalendex does allow prior lenalidomide, but you're not allowed to be refractory to it. And of course, they could have single agent lenalidomide and dex. But most patients at this stage are probably going to be lenalidomide refractory, and this is where patients are able to receive selinexor with Velcade and Dex, or even panobinostat with Velcade and Dex. And then, of course, you might say, well, if somebody's had a lot of PIs, do I really want to give selinexor with Velcade and Dex? And it may well be that what I call conventional chemotherapy may be another appropriate treatment, such as cyclophosphamide or melphalan. And I've listed the blue tech requirements at the bottom. Now, fourth line is where there has been a lot of changes recently. Essentially, the first thing to say is, I think, although you could access lenalidomide, I think the theme is that by that time, at fourth line, you would have exhausted your lenalidomide. I think it would be very unlikely to get to fourth line without having lenalidomide. So therefore, most patients at this time are able either to access a pomalidomide-based regimen or teclistamab or elranatamab. And I think it's important to think about what the requirements are so that you're able to access. So pomalidomide says that you're supposed to have a PI, an IMiD, and an alkylator treatment. So that's the first thing. Teclistamab, it's the anti-CD38. So it's not just the PI, it's not just the IMiD, it's the fact that you need an anti-CD38. And there may well be people further up the pathway or who in prior therapies have not received an anti-CD38 at that point. So the other thing to say is that at fourth line, if they've not received an anti-CD38, that's really their last current opportunity to receive a CD38 monoclonal antibody, either in the form of daratumumab monotherapy or isatuximab with pomalidomide and dexamethasone. So this is a really important time point for patients if they've got to fourth line with no 38 monoclonal antibody and they want to access some of the newer treatments. The other thing to say is that isatuximab pom-dex remains on the CDF. It's gone to appeal, and obviously we await the outcome for that, so you can still prescribe it. So what I've done is I've just illustrated some cases, really, just to go through some of the points that I've discussed. So the first one, and these are actually patients I saw yesterday in clinic, so I just thought these two just kind of illustrate the point. The first one went through VTD, MEL auto, had DARA VD, IRD, and then they have a decision about what fourth line they can receive. And because they've received a PI, an IMiD and an anti-CD38, they could receive either teclistamab or elranatamab, or you may choose to do a pomalidomide regimen. And of course, whatever you give fourth line, you could flip into fifth line. So if you've not had pom at fourth line, then maybe you could give pomalidomide at fifth line, etc. But actually, it's the group of patients that haven't received the anti-CD38 monoclonal antibody that we just need to think about. So this is a patient who's actually gone through 2 prior lines of treatment. He had VTD auto, it was in COVID, so he had IRD, and he's now for third-line treatment. So the first thing to say is, clearly he could access selinexor with Velcade and Dex, but actually he's recently received a PI. So would that be an appropriate treatment? And I guess the alternative would be to consider some kind of conventional chemotherapy, maybe a cyclo-based regimen. Then when you get to fourth line, okay, he has not had a CD38 monoclonal antibody. So that means that even if you wish to give him TEC or LRAN, you're unable to do so. So in the current pathway, I would suggest probably isopom-dex would be the best thing for him, or you could consider daratumumab monotherapy, and that would then mean that in order for him to receive the new T-cell engagers, he would have to go onto fifth line. So he'd have to go through 2 lines before he got to fifth line TEC and LRAN, and then potentially sixth line POM-based regimen. In terms of fifth line, I think I'm essentially repeating exactly what I've said. There's nothing essentially different to what I've said, but there will be a group of patients that are penta-refractory, have exhausted all other therapies, and remember, penta-refractory is 2 PI, 2 IMiD, and an anti-CD38, and they could consider selinexor monotherapy. So, the pathway is clearly complex, and I hope that I've made it easier to navigate. I really think we need to move away from the concept of lines. Trials, everything is moving towards exposure and refractoriness. And I think moving forward, I would hope that NICE and others, and Pharma and others will allow us to do that. The other thing to say is that when you get beyond second line, really, most patients are now len refractory, at least PI exposed, anti-CD38 exposed. And actually, it's great that you've got selinexor with Velcade and Dex, but there is, I think, a gap in the treatment pathway. Clearly, we need to talk about toxicities, side effects, patient wishes. Really, it's all about holistic care. And then I think it's really important that we give the best treatment at the time that we're able. It's very famous data that looked at the number of patients by lines of treatment, and we always remember the patients that we're seeing in front of us on the day, but actually we need to give the best treatment at the time that we're able to do it, rather than necessarily trying to forward plan, because there will be an attrition, sadly, of patients that aren't able to receive what we would consider to be appropriate treatment. Clinical trials, as I said, are really important. Palliation and best supportive care will clearly be important at some point during the pathway, and clearly one size does not fit all. I just wanted to say thank you to the advocacy team. I think we don't tend to sell ourselves, particularly I think within the community. We do a lot of work with all of these appraisals, and I'd just like to thank the people who have done appraisals in the last year or two. And it's important that we are collective in our working. So it's ourselves working with Myeloma UK, working with our industry partners, and of course working with NICE and NHS England. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the great talk. Any questions? Colleagues who have joined us online can submit their questions through the portal.